This is about the elected judiciary, something we haven't heard anything about today. But in our short time together, obviously, we have heard repeated references to the significance of Janet Protasiewicz. I hope I have that correct. There will be a pronunciation test after a few beers later, and her election to the Supreme Court. And the repeated references are for good reason. The elected judiciary, as many of you know, is playing an increasingly crucial role in states where the individual rights of Americans are on the ballot, from abortion, LGBTQ rights, and redistricting. Yet there was no more consequential judicial election than in Wisconsin this year, when Justice Protasiewicz swept into office in the most expensive judicial race in American history. But the story does not end there, as we've learned today. As Attorney General Call talked earlier this morning, she is now being threatened with impeachment by the Republican majority, who claims she crossed a red line, so to speak, when she described the legislative maps as rigged. And I hope we'll get to questions about the appropriateness of a judicial candidate making comments about her personal conclusions and how they should play when she actually takes office. But we are fortunate to have three people who know this issue very well. Alejandro Verdin is Protasiewicz's was Protasiewicz's campaign manager. He is here on the right. Michael Wagner, the University of Wisconsin Madison journalism professor and political science professor, along with Felesia Martin, a Wisconsin Democratic Party vice chair and also a Milwaukee County supervisor. They're here to examine what the election means for Wisconsin and what it portends for the rest of the nation. So I hope, as always, you come with your questions. We'll let them offer up a lay of the land as they view it, and then we'll dive into the discussion. Thanks very much. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thanks for having me. We're excited to have this conversation about the race and about the aftermath, which has been covered, which is great. But I'm Alejandro Verdin, and I've been working in Wisconsin politics for the past couple years, originally from the West Coast. So it was an interesting perspective to kind of be an outsider working on this campaign, while having some experience in the state and all the dynamics. And we're really excited of the results, and we're not excited about what's going on right now, and I know we're going to be talking about that. But hopefully we'll be able to answer any of your questions, hopefully not too many of them. But I'll pass it over to Felesia.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you had a great session thus far. We'll go off the rails probably this afternoon. And this is no offense to anybody who said my name. My name is not Felesia, although she's a beautiful and wonderful person, she's not me. My name is Felesia, and it is very important to pronounce people's name correctly from my perspective, because I did a massive mashup of somebody's name once before, and he explains the difference between the two names, and it was huge. It was huge, so I always make a joke out of that. But again, it's not anything to your, I did make sure that you understood how to pronounce my name. So, Felesia Martin, Milwaukee County Board Supervisor, first Vice Chair of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. I got involved literally, I've been engaged and followed politics since I was 6. I'm 12 now, so that'll give you a time frame. And I really got physically, actively, financially, and all of my human resources involved in politics when we came upon the most consequential election of my life, which was that historic election in 2008 for Barack Obama. And from that moment forward, seeing the landscape and where our country was going politically and how it wasn't going well for all Americans, I figured at that moment, and I came to a decision that I would never again allow any election to go past where I have not put sweat equity into it to ensure a healthy outcome for the people in my neck of the woods and in the state of Wisconsin. And after that engagement, it has been ramping up, and not ramping up necessarily in a good way. When you look at our political landscape, everything is hyper partisan, and now it's not even hyper partisan, it's just whack job city across the board, because you're wondering, who are these people? Where did they come from? And when did Americans just hand over their rights and says, okay, you make all the decisions for me, and we'll just abide by that. It doesn't matter if you are taking over my personal body, you just continue to make those decisions for me. And it was at that point I said, we have really gone off the rails, so how do we help right the train, how we pull all the cars out of the ditch and get back on the expressway? And we do that simply, one election at a time and with facts, not personal truths.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mike Wagner. I'm a professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication here at UW-Madison. And a couple of points I think I'll make that I hope are useful for your questions you might want to ask to any of us later are about, one, the way that judicial elections have changed in Wisconsin over the last decade. So one big change over the last, or maybe decade and a half, is how partisan the elections have become. So it's a nonpartisan election. Janet Protasiewicz did not run with a D behind her name, but she ran with dollars raised by the Democratic Party among her own campaign and other donors. But one big change is that the donor networks for Supreme Court candidates 2 decades ago were very bipartisan, measured as who gives money to Republican and Democratic candidates for office and who gives money to which state Supreme Court candidate. There was much more heterogeneity, there was much more interactivity between giving 2 decades ago than there has been in the last couple of judicial elections, and there was an even more striking lurch to a partisan nature in giving in this last election. And so that's one big thing that's changed, is that the donor networks have changed, the party's willingness to say this is the person has changed. And so those are just differences in what's happened in the past. One other change that's happened is that as the office has been a more political office in terms of the campaign, it's been really fascinating to me to watch how news reporters have treated the aftermath. Because I think there's a structure that reporters look for in the judiciary that is nonpartisan or apolitical and about what's rooted in the law and what's the ideological nature of how justices interpret the Constitution and make decisions. But what was happening were things that happen after partisan elections. So the last time the state Supreme Court shifted its ideological balance, the conservatives did all of the things the liberals did this time. Firing the clerk, all that sort of stuff. All that happened in just the same way. Which is what happens after an election. The winning side takes over. And the framing in a lot of news coverage I've seen has been, it's been a rocky start for the liberal majority, it's been a contentious, it hasn't. What always happened again, and this time the losing side didn't like it and made a lot of noise about it, but it was no different than what that same set of people did when they had the majority power. And so, there's, one thing journalists like to do is point out inconsistency. And I've seen less of that kind of coverage, and I've seen more of the court isn't abiding by what we expect courts to do kind of coverage. And I think it's done a bit of a disservice to the audience, who have competing expectations of what it is they want their Supreme Court justices to do in places where they're elected. And so Wisconsinites contain multitudes in terms of their attitudes. And so on the one hand, they want courts to be making decisions that are rooted in the law. And on the other hand, they want the justices they voted for to do things that are consistent with their own policy views. And sometimes those two things butt up against each other. And it makes it for a much more difficult story to tell, because it brings together partisan politics and judicial politics in a way that we normally had believed they were separated, even if they actually weren't separated that way. So that's another thing that I think has changed. And then the last point I want to make just about Wisconsin is that we are relatively unique in terms of swing states, in terms of how polarized we are in our state as compared to folks who live in other swing states. And so in survey research we've done where we compare large samples of Wisconsinites to large samples of folks in North Carolina, Ohio, Michigan, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, we find Wisconsinites' attitudes are more extreme in terms of their judgments about political leaders, but also about labor unions, large corporations, trust in the news. Wisconsinites' attitudes are number one, which is to say they're the most extreme across all of these other sorts of states, to the point where fully half of us in our state report that we've stopped talking politics to somebody because we disagree with their views, and 1 in 5 of us say we've just cut somebody out of our life because of political disagreements, which is a little bit higher than folks in other swing states. So the contention is at the grassroots level, it's at the family table, it's certainly at the Statehouse, as we see, but it's just it's a part of the way our politics has been really since Governor Walker and Act 10. That's probably the point where this really shifted into overdrive.
Thanks for those words to set the table for this. So as always, questions, and we'll get a microphone to you.
Hi, I'm Haley B. Miller. I work for the USA Today Network in Ohio. Ohio has partisan judicial elections now. Last year was, I believe, the first year that was in place. How common is that now, and do you expect to see that in more states as this idea of the sort of neutral, nonpartisan judiciary continues to be challenged?
Michael.
It's not that common. It's possible it could become more common. People really like to believe that they are nonpartisan and that they support nonpartisan things. When you ask people, are you a Republican, Democrat, or independent? A third to 40% of people say independent. And then we say, but do you lean one way or the other? And all but about 6 or 7% of us lean one way or the other. And then we ask those same leaners, have you ever voted for somebody on the other side? And they say no. And so, so a lot of us are closet partisans. And so there's not, a lot of support, but at the same time, there's not a lot of support to change judicial elections to partisan ones. The benefits, I would say, are that it's a much clearer signal to the voting public about what they might expect from those folks if they were elected. The negative, of course, is that we also might then expect them to engage in more partisan jurisprudence, which might not comport with how we might expect them to read the Constitution or interpret the law. And so those things are not always in pure agreement. But it's not very common. It's probably going to become a little bit more common, but I wouldn't expect it to happen rapidly. But you're not going to make any money betting on that stuff in Vegas, I don't think.
I would hope it would not become partisan, because if we're a country made up of laws and then we're supposed to be governed by the rule of law, I don't believe the rule of law is partisan, or it ought not be in theory, right? So if we're going to talk about being parties of laws, our judiciary most certainly should not be partisan, but we know we've always had activist courts. Whether we want to accept that or believe it or not, we've always had activist courts, and it has been my fervent hope that we would not have that, that they would govern according to law. And one word that I have come to really have a disdain for is precedence. Because something is precedence, that's what we're going to follow, and yet we find that they throw that out the window when it doesn't fit their personal narrative or their personal values and views. So I would hope that Wisconsin most certainly would not follow Ohio's lead. I would love to see the judiciary be just that. Give us the facts according to the law.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, people naturally want to believe that when they go into a courtroom, they're going to get a fair shake, and that people's, those justices and judges' beliefs or personal opinions aren't going to affect the outcome, right? Whatever it may be. I think it's going to also depend on what state you're in and what issues are really important in those states. I think with Roe v. Wade kind of thrown out the window, that's going to be dependent per state, right? It was all here important in Wisconsin because of the issues that we faced. Voters knew that if we really wanted to have a fair shake, we needed to elect a justice that was going to kind of keep those blinders on. And we knew because we experienced in the past, Justice Dan Kelly, that we weren't going to get that. And so, some people believe that, Janet was talking about issues and talking about how she'd rule, and that just wasn't the case. She was talking about the law, upholding it. The angle we took was when talking about our personal beliefs was that, you're going to vote for this person, and you should, before you go vote for them, you should know who they are and what they kind of believe, and what they, what makes them them. That's important. Never was she saying, I'm going to vote this way, or I'm going to, I don't like the way those maps look, so I'm going to throw them out. None of that was ever said because no cases were in front of the court. She needed to look at the legal arguments on both sides. Obviously, our opponents love to play that the way they'd like to play it and spin it the way they'd like to. But when we were talking about issues, and bringing this back to your question, people always wanted to know that, because we all have our beliefs. I don't care how nonpartisan you are. I don't care how pristine your record is. You believe in something. And so we wanted to give voters a kind of look into who she was, but also respect that she wasn't going to prejudge a case, or she wasn't going to say this is what I'm going to do. So I think, to bring it back to your question, depends on which states we're looking at, and I think it also depends on, how comfortable those justices are, or those candidates are with going and pushing the envelope a little bit. I think there are still a lot of candidates that just aren't comfortable with that. Janet believed different. She believed that people do deserve to know how I feel, and they deserve to pair that against my track record.
I think that's actually, an interesting point that is worth journalists considering, because so many journalists have views about things, but try to set them aside to be fair, to be neutral when useful, to be objective when useful, to be, but at least be fair-minded to the people and groups and topics that they're covering, even though they have their own views. And so you might ask a journalist, do you think that the candidate who gets the most votes is the candidate that won the election? And if the journalist says yes, it'd be sort of peculiar. Ha ha ha, look at that bias in favor of majoritarian election counting, right? And so to have a candidate for the Supreme Court say, these maps are rigged, all districting maps are rigged. Some more successfully in a partisan way than others, but they're all designed with a particular kind of purpose. And you could interpret all of them as being rigged. Some of them are less rigged in a partisan way, but they're all designed to make some elections more competitive and some elections less competitive, and benefits candidates from some parties and hurt candidates from other parties. And so that's not a statement about how one would rule. Right. Now, I think it's also fair to say, I'll bet most of her supporters interpreted that as a statement about how she would rule. Like, they are expecting her to want to overturn these current maps, and they're expecting her to endorse maps that are better for the Democratic Party. I would say most voters in Wisconsin who voted for Justice Protasiewicz want that outcome. That's not her problem, but I think it's also true.
The thing too, I think the thing that has been covered was the statements of the maps are rigged.
Yeah.
Which she said, which an overwhelming majority of Wisconsinites do believe in.
It's also empirically true.
It's true.
They're the 8th most gerrymandered districts of any redistricting in any state in the history of the Republic.
But it's also what was said in Jill Karofsky's dissent of the case that came before the court. So she didn't say anything that was new.
Right.
In fact, she agreed with a sitting justice's decision. On
the minority side.
On the minority side.
Yeah.
And so, it was funny seeing that because, Republicans like to spin it, and to their credit, I would have done the same thing. But there was nothing wrong. There was no, oh, this is what we're going to do, because one, there wasn't a case before the court. She didn't know what the legal arguments were going to be on either side. She didn't know what the questions were going to be. She was just stating fact that they're rigged, which they are. And so it was interesting kind of seeing that kind of play out, because the narrative that came out of that was the maps. She said that the maps are rigged, so she's going to vote this way, or she believes this. It's like,
It was never stated as such.
that was never stated. Also, if the car's red, the car's red. I can't really fight that. So that, to that point, it was interesting.
Well, if we're talking about training up journalists and looking at stories, why is it that one key word in Judge's statement, as well as in the Republican Party's statement, why was that the phrase that was picked up on rather than another story? Why do we go after the hot button issue only? Is it to get the headline? Or is your responsibility to get to the truth? Again, if you would have seen that headline or read that statement and say, okay, well, what's the backstory to these maps? Why is it rigged? What has been previous rulings from the state court? What was the dissent of the minority or the majority judge in these cases? I don't recall seeing any of that backstory being a part of a piece. See, I like Walter Cronkite, Jessica Savage kind of reporting, where you dig beyond the headline, beyond that hot button phrase. Do your homework, do the research. Why is that such a thing that the Republican Party knew that journalists would pick up on and deflect from what they have truly been doing on our courts, such as a judge actually taking the rule of law and having that as its plumb line in just making their decision on how they will rule in a case. And then when that person uses that plumb line, they and their families are then threatened. Why do we do that? Why do we go that, looking for that hot issue instead of the crux of law? If that makes sense to people.
Hi, Clara Hendrickson, Detroit Free Press. I wanted to sort of bring in the perspective of Michigan, where I kind of feel like we have the worst of both worlds. We have party conventions to nominate justices and then nonpartisan elections, which I don't know if that's very transparent for voters. And I sometimes struggle to sort of figure out how to put those partisan affiliations in the context of any decisions from the court, and how to sort of explain that to voters beyond just sort of name checking that party ID. And then I am also wondering if you all have thoughts on making it clear to voters how important it is for justices to be upfront about how they're ruling on any given issue. We have decisions and we don't always know how the court breaks down, and these are elected officials. Is it important for voters to know on any given order what the breakdown is among individual justices? Thanks.
Yeah. To your second question, I think one thing that also hasn't really been covered as well as I think I would have appreciated here in Wisconsin, one of the first key moves that the majority did was open administrative hearings, to making it open to the public, allowing a process that's transparent and that is easily accessible for the public. Obviously, that is an effort that has there's been efforts to thwart it by the conservative justices on the bench, but I think that's an important factor, right? And that's something that Judge Janet campaigned on. I think she also campaigned on, trying to figure out what kind of recusal rule we could put in place, not necessarily saying that, a justice should recuse, but trying to figure out through studying or through putting a panel together or through getting public input, what a recusal should look like. Is there a threshold for certain contributions? Is there, what does that look like? That's something that she, was very interested in. That's something that was also opposed by our opponents. And so, there have been these efforts to be more open, to be transparent, and to be accountable to Wisconsinites that has been opposed for some weird reason. I really don't know why. I have some ideas, but I think, to your second question, it's going to be key kind of figuring that out and what that looks like. Because yes, these are nonpartisan races. People don't believe they're nonpartisan. We received contributions from the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Our opponent received contributions from the Republican Party of Wisconsin. As much as our opponent liked to claim that he was a purist and nonpartisan, he ran his last campaign out of the Republican Party's headquarters. Right? And so, that also doesn't mean that a justice doesn't have the capability to put on those blinders and vote and make the decisions that are rooted in the law. That is very possible. But also that is why the majority of justices are, I think, trying to create a process that is transparent, that holds them accountable, and that makes the public feel a little bit more comfortable with the decision. So I think that also leads to why are they voting this way? No one's gonna go look at a 50-page dissent or ruling, but except for our friends, right? But if we're able to make things accessible and transparent, that's good, and that kind of gives an in into what they're thinking and how they're doing it. I also think it's also important, though, and I would hope that the justices would agree, that that's also their decision and how they vote it's personal. It should be coveted. Also should be rooted in the law, but also it needs to be protected from any outside forces that are trying to, put their will, whether it be a donor, whether it be a special interest group, or whether it be, a political party. So that's really key in making sure that they're not able to talk about how they're going to rule on a case, which that's why judges don't talk about these things in public.
I think judges who run for office can do a better job of explaining their judicial philosophy and explaining the constraints that any given case might have with respect to that philosophy. So I think about it like I've got a 15-year-old daughter, and so when she turns 16, our philosophy will be to let her drive a car. We want her to have that experience. We want her to have that freedom. If the first time she wants to drive at night with her friends where we don't know where she's going, maybe we'll constrain that. Maybe we'll constrain it to say, we have to drive with you at night 10 times before we are happy with you, or whatever it is, right? And so the philosophy is one thing, but the constraint of a case is another. And it's incumbent upon candidates to explain both, in my view, to the people who are voting for them. Here's my broad opinion about what the Wisconsin Constitution means in this phrase. Can I predict the nuances of the case that's going to come before us? Maybe the case that's consistent with my philosophy won't have standing, and so we'll reject it anyway. And so they just need to be more upfront with that stuff, which is certainly more prose than poetry. And of course, folks want to campaign in poetry, but I think we owe it to the voters to describe both of those things. For elected judges, I think it's important. Otherwise, it's just sort of a ruse. Otherwise, they all have opinions. It's not like they're blank slates and then suddenly discover the law once they are seated at the bench.
I agree. But I don't have anything else to add to that other than for looking at how judges approach their campaigns, I would say look at Judge Everett Mitchell, who also ran in our race.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And look at how he approached those questions and presented himself. And when he was asked about case law, look at his responses. I'm going to challenge each one of you for that, for your homework. And you will see how a judge really should be responding from my perspective when they're running for a state Supreme Court race. You reveal who you are, yet you can't say how you're going to rule on a case simply because you don't know the credits of the case. You don't know all the points of that case. So how can you possibly say, I will definitely rule X, Y, and Z? You can't.
Question for Alejandro. Jack Kelly from Wisconsin Watch, formerly of the Cap Times. Good to see you. I think it's been since election night since I've seen you, so hope you enjoyed your time off. How concerned are you that Assembly Republicans will impeach Justice Protasiewicz? And what, if anything, are you, as a political advisor to her, what is she doing to prepare in case something like that happens?
Yeah, listen, I'm very concerned. I think people all across the state are concerned. I think that, listen, I'm going to be blunt. This is just a power grab because some folks are upset that they lost an election. This isn't the first time we're seeing some of this stuff. Mm-hmm. When Governor Evers was elected, Walker and the Republicans decided to strip him and other constitutional officers of their powers because they lost an election. Donald Trump lost an election, and he tried to do everything in his power to discredit those results. And we're seeing the same play happen right now. This is nothing new. What is interesting is if they do it or not, right? Like you're seeing Robin Vos saying, yeah, we're gonna do this. And then he's also like, well, I never said we were gonna impeach her. We said that she should recuse herself. And then, then you have, other, folks in their caucus kind of backtracking because I think they understand the political ramifications that are gonna come if they do follow through with this. I mean, I think one thing that we also have to highlight is that Judge Janet is a very popular person in this state. She won by 11 points. That doesn't happen often. So when you if you try to discredit her or in a way that is not fun, but also if you try to overturn the will of the people, they're going to respond. So listen, I think there's a concern that these threats are being made. Will they do it? I don't know. I think they need to look at their political calculus and see if they can do it or not. But I also think they're looking at folks in their caucus to see if they have the votes or not. And I don't think they got them. I mean, I don't know. I could be wrong. But if you were going to do it, you would have done it. Now, there are other ways. There are other, political tactics they could do, right? They could impeach her to remove her. And y'all have been reporting on that process, but if they do impeach her, then she automatically gets removed from cases that she hasn't even seen a case yet. But with that impeachment process, they would remove her, and she can't be on a case, can't hear the arguments, so then she can't rule on a case. That could be a strategy for them, if they're thinking that she's going to vote a certain way or not. I don't know how they're going to get that if she hasn't even ruled on a case yet. But I think it also speaks to them being afraid of losing their power and seeing what comes of certain decisions. Do maps go before the court and the justices rule that these are unfair maps and we need to figure out how to right this wrong? Or they're certainly afraid of losing their power in that sense. But we'll see. I mean, it's concerning, and I think the only thing she can do is do her job and see what comes.
There's not some sort of preparation, to be prepared in response. I imagine that if she is impeached, there would be, some sort of lawsuit filed. Is there preparation ongoing on that?
Yeah, that's something she's going to have to explore, right? Like if she wants to explore that or not, we're not sure yet because we don't know what's going to happen. She doesn't know what's going to happen. So literally, all she could do is do her job and hope that a case comes before the court and she can, once again, do her job. She hasn't even been able to do that, which is such a disservice to folks. But we'll see.
Hi, I'm Jad Khalil. I work for VPM News in Richmond, Virginia. I wanted to ask about sort of national party. You mentioned sort of there were state contributions from the state parties to some of the candidates. What was the interaction with the national political parties into this race and other sort of nonpartisan judicial elections?
If you read the reports that were filed, there's no DNC dollars spent in her race, to the best of my knowledge.
Is there any
This is a state. It was a state race, of course, and it's our constituents, our members pay attention to that, and they gave their dollars to the candidate that they felt spoke to their values, and so they voted for Judge Janet. But it came down to an issue, abortion. Janet won by 11 points, and how do you think she won that? It was from women. Women were ticked off that their rights were being trampled upon, and they were being sent back to the 1950s, and they needed someone who was going to stand up, that they felt was going to stand up for them, and so that's what they did. The National Party, I'm a member of the DNC, we tend to allow states to handle their state issues.
Is there any, I guess this is an important election in terms of knowing the lay of the land in Wisconsin, which is a swing state, so I would imagine that there would be some sort of interest in it. Is that something that you think is sort of looking forward to future elections and knowing sort of where voters are, that abortion is important to them and that sort of thing? Should there be more of an interest from national parties in these sort of elections?
For state races, I believe, and this is my view on it, the national should not be engaged in it. If there are national implications in a race, then of course, presidential, absolutely. State races should be under state authority. Now, if the national want to give us talking points or want to do something of that nature, cool. But no, I think it should be the state party. As you can tell, I'm not really a politico because I have my own thing. That's my belief. And if you look at the race, that's what happened.
Hi, Maggie Mullen with Wildfile. I'm from Wyoming. We do not have judicial elections in Wyoming. We have sort of a bifurcated system wherein first there's a merit selection by a commission that's made up of attorneys. They come up with 3 names. The governor then chooses that person. And so this is all very fascinating and very new to me. And so I'd be interested to hear if any of you think that, there are any ways that a state like Wyoming, what a state like Wyoming might be missing because judges are not, selected through, the will of the voters.
Yeah, listen, I love the Wisconsin model. I think, you should run for your seat. I think you should allow voters to make those decisions. I think, I think the thing that you miss is that people in communities then don't have a say in who represents them. And then I think that leads to a lack of diversity on the bench. That leads to a lack of transparency. That leads to a lack of talent, too, right? So, I like the old model of run for the seat, and if the voters choose you, then that's what it is. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I should clarify. I forgot the second part of the system is there are then retention elections.
Yes.
But voters obviously are not involved with, the selection or the sort of first part.
Yeah, I mean, listen, in Illinois, you run for the state Supreme Court. It's also then divvied up in certain district, right, certain appeal court district. And then there's also, for other judges, there's a retention model as well, I think after 10 years or so. I still don't like that model. And because then, in Illinois, a state that's infamous for like backdoor political deals and, picking and choosing what, who's going to run for next. I like the model of you should run, people should be, have an option to choose from. I think, also not to disrespect the retention model because that is also, you're being judged by your peers and that's fine. But I think from seeing how elections run and how they work, people have favorites. And I think you got to give it up to the people to decide who they want to represent us. I think also, one thing I'd love to see, especially here in Wisconsin, is we've never had a black or brown justice. And I think that opportunity to run for an office allows you to, allows for that to happen. Because I think, we don't see that enough. And I think that has to happen.
It should be the will of the people.
Yeah.
If we're going to be governed for the people and by the people, they should be able to elect whom they want in those various seats, regardless of where it is. If it's a federal role, state, county, or city, town, or village, it should be by the people.
I think what you miss is a clear explanation of who has the power. Who selects the committee of attorneys?
The Wyoming Bar Association.
And so what's the ideological makeup of who they give money to, and how does that work, and who do they, and so I think just, you're really constraining who has power in that kind of situation. On the one hand, as I think Alejandro was saying, it's peers, right, and it's peers with a particular professional expertise, and so that's appealing, I think, but you lose this whole other area of what names are never a part of that three, what characteristics of candidates are never a part of that three, and how is that driven by who ends up getting selected, in that group. And so I think you really cede a lot of authority to an unelected group of people with a professional interest in the outcome in that case.
Hi, Ben Giles from KJZZ in Phoenix. We, like Wyoming, have judicial appointees and then retention elections. And I can tell you it's, I think to most voters, a part of the ballot that they might just skip over. It's the largest portion of the ballot because it's judges from local all the way up.
Roll-off is way higher on judicial elections than virtually anything else on a ballot.
Yeah, so I just wanted to hear from y'all historically in Wisconsin, is this a new phenomenon that these elections are garnering so much attention? And if so, how you saw that take shape? Because I have a hard time seeing that level of interest in the retention elections that we have in Arizona, despite the conflicts over some very animus issues that are out there right now.
But retention elections, there's no opponent, right? There's no. Do you retain this person?
There's no opponent.
And so that's not an election as much in the same as, have I heard anything that I can also recall accurately that makes me think this person shouldn't be a judge? Probably not, right, in most cases. And so I just think that's a completely different kind of animal. And it's interesting because Arizona is a place where lots of statewide elections are close, and so I imagine there would be interest in a judicial contest, but a retention is just, it's hard. I think it's hard to get voters excited about that. You mean I have to go read about someone who, if I don't like them, there's not an alternative? That seems like a waste of my time.
Yeah.
And Wisconsin was just a perfect storm, right? Like putting on my political hat here. In 24, we have a presidential contest, and here in Wisconsin is a tipping state every cycle. I'm talking in terms of the interests of the race. Will we see this elsewhere? I think it's been kind of growing into a monster in Wisconsin, right? I think Justice Rebecca Dallett was probably the first.
She was.
To run, and people really didn't pay attention to that race until it was like, oh, whoa, she has a shot, because liberals never really had a shot. And also, it's kind of hard to go to battle when it's like, oh, we won Rebecca Dallett's seat. It's like, all right, cool. Then we have two people on the court that are, liberal now. It's like, it's still a conservative majority. And then, so she was the first one to really campaign and win the seat. And then that kind of sparked a lot of optimism. And then you had, Judge Lisa Neubauer, who came really close and lost by a hair's length. But then a couple years later, we won with Justice Karofsky. But it was a perfect storm in Wisconsin because, one, the political contest that it's historically we have in Wisconsin, this was a seat that was going to be for the majority. People understood that, so people would be more willing to be invested. And then the issues that folks anticipated that would come before the court was of deep, deep interest. And then also you had the factor of a right being stripped away from women that the majority of women only knew their entire lives being stripped away. That sparked a lot of interest and a lot of frustration. That was a key. That was key in our race, right? So it was a perfect storm. In Ohio, I think we have there's 3 elections, right? There's 3 Supreme Court seats up for grabs, but they only need 1 to get the majority or something like that. And Pennsylvania has a seat, but I don't even think it's for a majority. So it's like I don't know if we're going to see this again until 2025 when there's going to be another Wisconsin Supreme Court race.
But wouldn't you also add what happened in 2020 with the ballot boxes?
Yeah.
And
Sure.
I think that's what jumped off what you saw in this race. It really woke people up to the fact, oh my goodness, voter suppression, stripping away of rights, one after another, and people have finally said, or actually they finally woke up and said, this is real. Our rights and our privileges and everything is being taken away from us, and there's the appearance that we're not paying attention and that we're not gonna do anything. And I think this was the moment when folks said, hold on, we're not gonna take this anymore, you're not gonna continue to strip away our rights, and we're not gonna say anything. And the abortion issue is what just really pushed us over the edge, and women said, hold on, no more, you've gone too far, you've crossed this line, and we're gonna have to save ourselves. We can't look for someone else to do it. We have to do it and find those candidates that are gonna fight on our behalf. To be clear, it wasn't just Democratic women. These were women across the board who came out and says, no more, we're gonna stand up and protect our rights. So I think that's where it brought us to this point.
Yeah, especially in the suburbs, I think.
In the suburbs.
Which has been a Republican stronghold in Wisconsin for quite some time.
And we've seen that being chipped away as rights are being stripped away and suppressed. And so those folks who typically is like, that's not my battle, kind of said, whoa, wait a minute. They're coming for me now, so I have to stand up and push back.
I think two other things I think have happened from a more historical perspective that are worth reporters digging into. One of which is the way we run statewide elections rhetorically has really changed. So when Tommy Thompson was governor, Republican governor, winning by a couple of touchdowns sometimes, but governing in a way that would make deals with Democrats, wouldn't constantly antagonize the university system, these sorts of things. But you have, I say this as a professor, as an interest in saying that, right? But then you have, when Governor Walker won, his strategy wasn't, I don't need 66% of the vote, I need 50.1% of the vote. And so there was a divide and conquer strategy, and that's really driven statewide elections since his election. And so things have been really close. Protasiewicz's election was not really close. It was really notable, and I think abortion is probably the main reason that was true. But then the second thing, which I think is also really worth good investigative work in Wisconsin, is the last 3 winners on the liberal side have a pretty similar profile. Dalit, Karofsky, Protasiewicz. There's a playbook to win judicial elections in Wisconsin that probably has something, I bet you there's a good candidate recruitment story to tell there. I bet you there's a good split ticket voter story to tell there. There's lots of things about this particular profile of candidate and why is that appealing to voters who might vote for some Republicans and some Democrats or some liberals and conservatives. To me, that's an untold story of the last decade of Wisconsin judicial elections.
Can we stop spilling the secrets?
y'all. I'm Samantha from the Boston Globe. I kind of wanted to piggyback off of Ben's question, kind of about like apathy around some of these races. In Massachusetts, judges serve lifetime appointments or until they're 70, and they're like recommended by the governor, and it goes to the governor's council for a vote. The lieutenant governor of Massachusetts chairs the governor's council, and during the debates, the lieutenant governor's race was one of the most crowded this year. And many of the lieutenant governor's candidates couldn't name their own governor's counselor. These races aren't covered very well. Most people don't know who their own governor's counselors are. They're huge districts because there's like 7 of them in the whole state. But they have obviously like this really big power because they're confirming justices to serve on the SJC for a very long time. And I'm just wondering, like, in your kind of perception of the news coverage around, judicial races and things like that, what you would like to see more of in journalism in states that maybe justices aren't running on the ballot, but these are important races. Like, I don't know, just like lessons maybe that you've learned from kind of watching the fallout of this.
Well, one thing I would like to see is a day in the life of a justice, because most folks do not pay attention to the judiciary at all, unless it's a hot button issue, like, say, for instance, one of the superstars who emerged out of the Waukesha tragedy. If you use that as a case, for example, and allow a justice to then become a candidate for one of our highest offices in the state, simply because of the way she presided over a particular case, which in my personal purview was not very good. It was not very good. I mean, that was like a duh kind of case. So I would like to see on occasion those stars having the cameras follow them, even to see if their cameras are allowed in the courtroom, how they preside on particular cases, what do they do in their spare time. There is a judge in Milwaukee who supports so much that goes on in our communities. Pride Day, just a festival where children are being celebrated for Harvest Fest. She's at community brainstorming. We have a session on the 3rd Saturday of every month in Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee. And these judges, Dalit, Dugan, and several other judges, actually, they're there. And that is, it's not partisan at all. It is a community coming together, discussing issues like next week, I believe, on the 24th, it's gonna be human trafficking. And to see those judges present, listening to constituents about these different issues, because each month is a particular issue, and hearing their voice, that gives you an idea of who they are, and if they were to run for state Supreme Court, then you can have a pretty good feeling about when you cast a ballot for them or their opponent. Something of that nature would be very helpful for a voter. And because otherwise, we don't even know who some of these judges are, and then that's when a Wyoming system probably is a good thing. I don't know. That's something I'm still muddling through in my mind. What is the best approach?
I think it'd be useful for journalists to also think about an outside-in perspective in covering the courts. So rather than who are the judges and what do they do and what are their qualifications, look at what have the consequences been for 5 or 6 high-profile state Supreme Court cases. What did it do to communities where businesses ended up closing, or people ended up losing rights, or people lost access to health care, or gained access to the ballot box? What changed so that the stakes are clear to folks? And so, like, it's an easier thing for newspapers or websites that have more of an investigative focus, but audio folks can there's been good podcasts. I know Wisconsin Public Radio has done some good podcasts about why we didn't have high-speed, train that we were supposed to have, connecting the state, and how that happened, or they did one about redistricting that was also really good. It's hard to make redistricting an exciting topic, but they managed to do it, right? And so thinking of ways to creatively engage the audience about why stuff matters to them, rather than either the personality of the judge and that stuff, I think could also be a way to make it more interesting. There's a little bit of vegetables to it, I suppose, and hard to get people to eat their vegetables.
I agree with that. I mean, when Janet would go and campaign and talk to farmers, she would talk about some of the most important issues that came before the court that impacted them, their lives. And you think, well, how the hell does the court impact a farmer's life? But those issues do go in front of the court.
What can you call milk is a big deal to farmers.
And
Yes.
and so that's what we tried to do on the campaign trail. She wouldn't, we would stay away from hot button issues. We did address them when we had to, but she would talk about what the law means for your life. And you might not think it means a lot, but it does, right? They're looking at cases that are going to, determine, which rights you do have, which rights you don't have, and their judicial philosophy and their outlook is going to be important. I think, it was very important for Justice Protasiewicz to, when she was communicating to voters, talk about those things, because she wanted to make it abundantly clear that you should vote, not because you should just do it and it's your civic duty to do it, but because these are the issues that might affect you one way or the other, and you should have a say in that. And so that was very key. So I think highlighting that is important. Like what you said, it's not just who they do, who they are, and what they do, and what their qualifications are, and it's really talking about how these issues affect people.
Yep.
The timekeeper stands. So we'll have time for one more, and maybe I might sneak one in if nobody covers it. But
Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm with the New Jersey Monitor. So New Jersey, we do not have judicial elections. The governor appoints them, and then they're approved by the legislature. So voters are not a part of the process, other than electing the legislature, but not a part of the process at all, basically. So I'm curious, how we can get readers invested in this story when there's apathy, it sounds like, in states that have elections. We don't even have the election, so how do we get voters interested in that? And I'm also curious, which you kind of alluded to this, but covering the judges themselves versus the process, because we don't have access to judges because they don't run campaigns. So we don't know our judges, we don't get time with them, appointed by the governor, so we only get whatever the governor's office lets us have with them, basically. They just passed another law that we can't even see what town they live in anymore. So it's just further and further from the process. We have a judges shortage, so people can't get divorced in our state. So we cover the process a lot, but it's the same loop of the same stories. So how do we get people more interested in this, I guess?
That's rough.
Sorry, that was a long question.
That's rough. No, not at all. I didn't know that.
Thank you.
How about we cover the issues that are important to people's lives and link it to how judges are ruling?
How judges are what?
Ruling on particular issues. Mike just mentioned in Wisconsin, we're the dairy land, right? Until California started becoming our largest competitor. Jeez. What can be called milk? Those things are very important to people on a base level. So you have to find out what those top issues, not those hot button items, but true issues of value for people, and then link that up with the judiciary. That's how you get people to read. First of all, folks are so busy right now, but then there are those people who just veg out on politics in the judiciary. In my household, we have rigorous debates about who's who and who's great for us and who's good for us and who's not so good for us. Because we want to look at all of those key issues. Here in Wisconsin, lead pipes. And I would like to see GMO food products become a hot issue. I really think our government really needs to do something about that. So find those hot issues. Education is an issue. Quality of our water, climate, anything with environment, Those issues here in Wisconsin are key to most folks. So hearing how folks have ruled on certain issues, that would get folks' attention and start them to reading again. That's my simple answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would add that, as I just had said, like outside in for one kind of perspective, I think maybe actually inside out for the way you're talking about it. So pinning down candidates when they're running for governor about what do you look for in a justice is probably important to see if they actually do that when they ended up appointing people. But then another thing might be to just, in terms of source development within the executive branch, to know who are the other people they were considering. So at least the readers know what the options were. I'll try to speak up.
We love Siri.
So I think in that case it might be actually worth a little more inside baseball coverage, because it's more like a presidential election, right? Where they're going to say, hey, Biden wasn't shy about saying, I'm going to appoint people to the bench who, are, in favor of Roe. And so, that kind of thing, you could do the same kind of thing, for governor's races.
In New Jersey, are your judges appointed for a lifetime?
So they are reconfirmed by the legislature every 7 years.
Every 7 years, okay.
And they're always confirmed.
Yeah, some sort of, like from a journalistic point of view, some sort of pressure mechanism on those that do make those decisions, whether it be the legislature or the governor. Like you pointed out, that has to be done. I mean, people don't know until we start telling them. And you obviously can't tell them because y'all don't have access. And so that's some sort of pressure mechanism is key. I didn't realize the governor had a lot of power like that.
It's another story, though. The thing you mentioned about not knowing where they live, another story to be told right now is just the increasing number of threats to elected officials. I mean, the number of threats to members of Congress has increased from a couple of hundred 7 or 8 years ago to 9,000 or something like that, I want to say, in 2021 or 2. And so, I live near Justice Karofsky, and she had to do all kinds of security stuff to her home after her election. And I don't know if it continues, but I know afterwards there was a real concern for a considerable time. And that's real. That's rough.
I like that idea of not having their addresses out there in the public.
It's more difficult for us because then we you can't tell if a judge has 3 houses,
right.
Or where do they actually live in New Jersey, or do they live in Pennsylvania, or do they live in New York? Because we've had those issues too. So
how could a judge afford 3 houses if they have 3 houses? And
right.
Where they
so
make
it's
money?
I understand the reasoning, and it happened in New Jersey because a judge's son was killed by a disgruntled person. So it makes sense from that side, but it's such a lack of transparency already that it just feels like they're taking more and more away, and it's so much harder to write these stories, make them interesting, and also not repetitive. So, but I appreciate all your thoughts.
Yeah, it's tough not to report the olds, right, instead of the news.
Yeah.
Then they don't have to submit? Sorry, I'm getting interested here. They don't have to.
I am too.
They don't have to submit some sort of statement of financial interest or none of that.
I think only if it's a conflict of interest. Otherwise, no, because they don't have
Luckily, judges have an unimpeachable view of deciding when they have conflicts themselves.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yikes.
it's listening to everyone here, it's shocking because I've always just covered Jersey where we don't have access, or know the parties that our judges belong to. Yeah. So
the safety concern is definitely a real thing.
Yes.
We can say this now because the election's over, but I'm pretty sure Janet is the only judicial candidate to have a security detail because the threats are real. The world is just getting crazier, and as we become more partisan, people want to act on those emotions, and so there were real threats. But I think there's no accountability mechanism if we're not given access like you explained to us.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Well, that should probably cap it. We've taken too much of your time, and we appreciate your generous comments here, laying out a very, very important issue, and one that requires much more examination, especially in New Jersey. I'm just hearing echoes of
Can't believe.
the Supreme Court justices and their disclosure statements and what we've learned and not learned just on that court. So again, many thanks for being here and participating and helping us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.